Good afternoon, everybody. Can everyone hear me okay in the back? Y'all hear me good? Perfect. Well, thank you all for being here for Senior Wednesday at the Museum of World Treasures. I'm thankful to say it's a very bright and sunny day out there today. I hope everyone's homes have been okay through all the rain that we've gotten lately. Um, just a few announcements going on here at the museum. So we have our extended summer hours happening from now until August 10th. So you should come visit the museum, bring any family who's normally working until 5, that kind of thing. We'll be open until 7 o'clock every day throughout the summer. So take advantage of those extended summer hours. And we also have some educational programs happening in addition to our regular programming. We have one called Hands-on History, where you get to, for an additional fee, hold real historic artifacts. And we'll be teaching you all about those artifacts and the people who made them. And we'll be doing that twice a day throughout the summer. So ask the front desk about that and they can tell you more. Also, we have our next Senior Wednesday coming up on July 2nd with Dr. Taiwo Bello, Assistant Professor of African History at Oklahoma State University. He'll be giving a talk called The Military Decades in Africa, War and Gender in 20th Century Nigeria. Dr. Bello says, the Nigerian Civil War marked the beginning of the contemporary confrontation between the Nigerian government and pro-Biafran activists whose activities have been found to paralyze economic, political, and social engagements in southeastern Nigeria. The Civil War was fought between Biafran and Nigerian soldiers, and the war's event led to the demise of many people in the Biafran heartland, especially women and children. This talk will explore how women in the Biafran heartland responded to these developments. Particularly, it focuses on women's attempts to escape wartime starvation by devising new survival measures and the implications of those measures aimed towards rendering the Nigerian government's war strategies ineffective. In this talk, he will suggest that women's broad support to Biafra qualified them as enemies of Nigeria, hence the attacks by the Nigerian soldiers. So mark your calendars for July 2nd. And we also will have a free to the public coffee with the curator coming up on June 26th, thanks to Humanities Kansas, when Lim Shepard will be giving a musical history presentation. So mark your calendars for June 26th. Today, also thanks to Humanities Kansas, we are happy to be hosting Dr. Isaias McCaffrey. He earned his Ph.D. in history from the University of Kansas in 1999 and has served as a professor of history at Independence Community College for 26 years and has served as adjunct professor of history for Southern New Hampshire University for 15 years. He is a past president of the Kansas Association of Historians, and his research interests include Native Americans, ethnic communities on the Central Plains, environmental history, and Kansas women. He is a longtime member of the Humanities Kansas Speakers Bureau and a board member of the Independence Historical Museum and Art Center. McCaffrey received the 2024 Edgar Langsdorff Award of Excellence in Writing from the Kansas Historical Society. He has authored many articles on local history and conducts walking and van tours that explore the heritage of old independence. Without further ado, please give a warm welcome to Professor Isaias McCaffrey.
All right, good sound system, I like that. Can't always rely on different places' IT equipment. This topic deals with the Osage Nation. They're one of the Native American communities which for several hundred years actually was one of the major populations, native populations in the state of Kansas. They face the same dilemma that many native communities faced during the American Civil War, which was, in effect, figuring out what was at stake. You know, why are white people killing each other? What's going on? And what's the best course of action for their communities to weather this crisis? And the Osage ultimately, and I'll explain the kind of the dynamics of that, the Osage ultimately predominantly are going to side with the winning side, with the North. it's unclear what would have happened to them if they had allied with the South, which certain Native American communities did, and in effect were punished as a result of that. The Osage, are going to perform significant service for the United States. That doesn't really translate into a lot of gratitude after the war is over with. The Osage, within just a few years, are going to be removed from Kansas and shipped southward into a much smaller territory, a reservation. On the other hand, though, it's kind of unknowable, but had the Osage been on the wrong side, the federal government in many cases simply took away tribal status and recognition to Native groups, some of which today, they're Indian people, but they're not recognized Indian people, so they don't get the kind of benefits that many other communities do. In the case of the Osage, they perform a number of functions and duties for the Union during the war. In terms of actual fighting, there's really sort of a single, you could say sort of a minor battle that the Osage fight in the late spring, early summer of 1863, which really, in terms of its size, is more like a skirmish than a battle. But it turns out that that particular fight had much greater consequences and much greater influence, I think, than early researchers have realized. I did work on this topic a number of years ago and found out that basically the events that took place in southeast Kansas were connected to Missouri history and Colorado history, that the players and the events tie all three states together. And I don't believe that the outcome of the Civil War was in doubt, but certainly had things gone differently and had not the Osage played the role they did, conceivably the war in the West could have been harder for the Union side and might have drug on longer than it did. So I need to start out and talk about who the Osage are and a little bit of background about the Osage people. Let's see if the clicker works. It does. The Osage are actually a Siouan nation. Most people are familiar with the Sioux in the Northern Plains, and actually there are Sioux peoples that run all the way up into Canada that are in places like the Dakotas, Montana, that region of the United States. But you have this other branch of the Sioux, and the spelling there is a little bit unusual. It's pronounced Vegiha Sioux. Originally, they inhabit the Ohio River Valley, so they're way east. At some point, they would have migrated and broken away from the other Sioux and gone east. But at some point during what we think of as the Middle Ages, maybe as early as around 1000 AD or so, Siouan people in the Ohio River Valley begin migrating westward, and that's what this map shows. They also break apart into separate units, and so we wind up with the Quapaw people, the Osage, the Kaw or Kansa, the Omahas, and the Poncas. And so all of those are related peoples who speak similar languages. The Osage and Kansa languages are almost the same, and so maybe the difference would be the difference between like American English and British English, but they really are the same language. Omaha is very close, and I think all of them are intelligible. In other words, if you were Quapaw, you could speak to someone who speaks the Osage language, and they would get the gist of what you're saying. They might have to ask you to slow down, and there might be a little bit of question, but really these are related folks. For the state of Kansas, the Kaw or Kansa arrived probably a little bit earlier, and then the Osage arrived in Missouri and Kansas. And the Osage are going to constitute, from a military, from a power point of view, the most powerful Native Americans in this whole part of the country. The Osage became allies with the French before the Louisiana Territory was sold to the United States. And the Osage basically dominated the whole region. Technically, it's French territory, but there are letters that exist in archives where, like, the governor of Louisiana is complaining about the Osage, that they won't do what they're told. They'll trade on their terms. But when you look at those old maps about colonial possessions, they oftentimes are a little bit fictitious because they don't account for the reality on the ground in which Native people oftentimes are really, they see it as their land and they're really in possession of it. So there were people already in Kansas before the Osage and Kaw arrived. Those are mostly Caddoan-speaking peoples. So we're here in Wichita. The Wichitas were here when Coronado arrived in the 1500s. By 1800, the Wichitas are down on the Edwards Plateau north of San Antonio. So the Siouan peoples arrive, and it's sort of like bowling balls. They enter the region and they push many of those groups southward, and others like the Pawnees and Arikara go northward. And so I think a lot of people imagine that Native communities are kind of static, that they've always been where they are in historic times. The answer is no. And also, the Osage, they didn't just kind of peacefully walk into Kansas. They conducted military operations. They fought with the people who were already here, and they defeated them, and then took possession of this part of the Central Plains. So kind of the Kevin Costner Dances with Wolves, Native Americans are all loving, and no, they're people. And the same things that motivated later white settlers to take the land also motivate Native peoples to push each other around as well. In blue, or I guess that's kind of a blue color, that's what scholars, some of whom use the term Osage Empire. This is really the height of Osage power, in which they control at least half of the state of Missouri, much of the Ozarks, a good portion of Oklahoma, and that's really just sort of the core regions. The Osage would range all the way out beyond the Arkansas River out to the high plains to hunt buffalo. So their power basically is much larger than just that blue area. But the Osage after 1800 begin, like many Native groups, going into decline in terms of numbers. And that's largely a consequence of old world European diseases that they did not have equivalent immunity to. And so the Osage begin shrinking in size in terms of their numbers, and also they begin losing land. Once the Louisiana Purchase happens, Thomas Jefferson was one of the people who prized the state of Missouri, and in 1808, it's William Clark of Lewis and Clark fame was the territorial governor of Missouri, and he brokered a deal in which the Osage were paid for a huge area in northern Arkansas and southern Missouri. They were paid the equivalent of like 3 cents an acre. It was a tiny amount of money, and Jefferson was very pleased. He said that Missouri was larger than his native state of Virginia, and that the land was richer because Virginia had been damaged by tobacco farming back in the colonial period. The Osage are then pushed out of most of Missouri and Arkansas, and they become principally Kansas Indians after 1800. And should point out that not all the Osage were consulted about this treaty in 1808. There were 2 southern bands that lived in northern Arkansas, the Black Dog Band and Claremore bands, and they were simply notified that there's been a treaty and your land was sold, get out. So when you study the whole treaty process, it's riddled with shady and sometimes outright dishonest action on the part of the United States. So there's kind of rough numbers that show you decline of the Osage population. By the time of the Civil War, roughly 4,500 individuals are left. Back 1790, there's an estimate of about 20,000 Osage. So already you've had huge losses, and some of those epidemics are actually recorded. Missionaries and other people noted that, gee, the Osage are sick and they're dying in large numbers. So the Osage by 1860, 61, when the Civil War breaks out, they're already knocked back on their heels, basically. They're already in trouble. And this war comes along, and it represents a further threat to their survival. So this is just a map that shows, I don't know if you can see it where you're sitting, there's little dots along the rivers that show where principal villages were located. In 1850, most of the Osage villages are along the Neosho River. During the Civil War, they're shifted west to the Verdigris River. But then you have other encampments as well. Some of them are hunting camps that would be regularly used on a seasonal basis. At the beginning of the Civil War, the Osage don't know what's going on. They don't understand the politics of the war. And so you have various white people who are influencing and trying to push the Osage in different directions. One of the most influential white individuals from the Osage perspective in 1861 is John Matthews. He was born in Virginia. He was a blacksmith, which was a very important profession. He could make tools and hatchets and things that the Osage greatly prized and needed. Matthews is pro-slavery. And so he's going to counsel the Osage to support the Confederacy, the breakaway government that's being created in the South. Ultimately, 11 states joined the Confederacy. Matthews is someone who had married into the Osage Nation. He had an Osage wife and had children. And so he was someone that early on, a lot of the Osage listened to. He's telling them, you should side with the South. The Indian agent for the federal government was a man named Andrew Jackson Dorn. When I first saw that name, I figured he must be from Tennessee, like Andrew Jackson. Actually, Andrew Jackson Dorn is pro-Confederate. He's pro-Southern, but he was born in upstate New York, and he attended the University of Vermont. So it's kind of, there were people who, for whatever reason, wound up affiliating with the other side geographically. But Andrew Jackson Dorn is supposed to be representing the United States government in its relations with the Osage, and I think other Native Americans as well with the Kaw. Dorn is not a good servant of Washington. He's actually working for the other side. What that means is, early on in the Civil War, the federal government really doesn't have a representative trying to build relationships and win the allegiance of the Osage. Dorn is, if anything, working in the other direction. The one voice that's substantial, that's telling the Osage don't side with the South, is a Jesuit priest. The name, people pronounce it different ways. This man was Flemish speaking from Belgium. So probably his name's not really John, it's probably Jan. And then in Dutch or Flemish, that would be Schoenmakers. Some people will pronounce it the German way, Schoenmaker or shoemaker. That's really what the name means. But he's a Jesuit priest, was multilingual, was highly educated, like many Jesuits are. And he had run the mission, the Osage mission in southeast Kansas. And Father John, scholars indicate that he's probably the person who best mastered, the white person who best mastered the Osage language really in history. He had basically near native proficiency. And he was one of these missionaries who really lived among the Osage, who learned a lot of their customs. And to be an effective missionary, you need to understand the culture. So he has a lot of pull with the Osage. And being a priest, he's anti-slavery. And the Osage, I don't think, really understood slavery as it was practiced in the antebellum South. There were different kinds of, if you took prisoners, other Native Americans, but it wasn't like slavery as we know it. And so this priest is telling the Osage, you shouldn't have anything to do with the Confederacy, that they are not, godly people, that they're practitioners of slavery. And so the Osage are being pulled in multiple directions. Father John's actually targeted by John Matthews, and he puts together a force of irregulars, basically bushwhackers. They tried to kill or capture this Jesuit priest, but he escaped early on in the Civil War period. Eventually, in 1862, you have a grand council that's held by the Confederates in Tahlequah, Oklahoma. That's the capital of the Cherokee Nation. And like 15 different tribes are invited to this grand council, which was led by General Albert Pike. And And the Osage were invited, and they sent like 12 or 13 of their chiefs south to Tahlequah to hear what the Confederate government had to say. And this was a very kind of a grand affair with feasting, probably abundant amounts of fire, water, whiskey to drink. Gifts were given. The Osage arrived in their best ceremonial clothing, and they felt very flattered by the kind of the VIP treatment they received. But not all of them agreed to sign on the dotted line and become allies of the Confederacy. The majority of these chiefs do actually at that point agree to side with the South. One of the reasons that they did was this prominent Cherokee chief, Stan Wadey, who, by the way, is also a brigadier general in the Confederate Army and commanded Confederate troops at the Battle of Pea Ridge. Stan Wadey told the Osage that Chief John Ross, the principal chief, that he backed the South. Apparently this wasn't really true, but they didn't know. And so it's interesting at this meeting that the Cherokees are also working out an agreement, a treaty with Richmond, with the Confederate government. And the Cherokees agreed, the ones who were there agreed to side with the Confederacy, but they also demanded like $70,000 in gold from the Confederate government. And apparently they got it. Apparently the Confederate government paid the Cherokees in gold. The Osage were not offered any money. What that reflects is that they're not as acculturated. I don't think these Osage chiefs, I don't think that it occurred to them to ask for money. That's only part of their world. And so four of the Osage band chiefs, 4 out of 12, refused to sign. And I found pictures of 3 of them. There's Hard Rope. His name is really Wahisaki, which is rope hard grammatically. Chetopa, Strike Axe, and couldn't find a picture of Little Bear. These 4 men respectfully refused. They mounted their horses and they rode back to Kansas. And at that point, the Osage are divided and really sort of in a watch and wait mode. They're not really actively on either side in terms of military action. They're waiting to see which way the wind is blowing, which was a wise policy, really. This map shows just the original Osage lands in Kansas. They go almost all the way to the Colorado line. And at the outbreak of the Civil War, most of your Osage their permanent encampments are over north and east of where the modern Osage reservation is located in red. So you can see how much land originally in Kansas the Osage had, which constituted close to 1/3 of the state. And then after the Civil War, what they're left with in the 1870s, that area in red. And of course, if you know your later history, Osage land will be allotted, and then each family gets 250-acre farms, and then the leftover land is then sold to white people. So today, the Osage don't own all of Osage County in Oklahoma. They own part of it, and they're buying it back slowly. It's piece by piece. So the goal, I think, is to get back the Osage reservation actually under the ownership of the Osage, but that's going to be a long process. This is pretty much where the war is at, right before the Osage fight this little battle in southeast Kansas. The North is winning the war in the West. The only holdout on the Mississippi River that was left was Vicksburg, which falls on July 4th. And then further east, this is the period in which Robert E. Lee's army is engaged in the Gettysburg campaign, invading the North for a second time. And of course, the Confederates lose the Battle of Gettysburg. So by July, the Confederacy is cut in half. The Mississippi River is in Union control. So things are pretty dire. That's really the point in which the end of the war, the defeat of the South, is really sort of coming into view. 2 months earlier, though, Vicksburg was still under siege, and it's at that point that the Confederates decide sort of a Hail Mary throw in the West to try to stir up trouble on the high plains and in the Rocky Mountain region. And Edmund Kirby Smith is basically the military commander of everything west of the Mississippi River. for the Confederacy, Smith may have come up with the idea, or maybe he and his staff formulated the idea of sending a Confederate force across Kansas to Colorado and New Mexico. And the idea was that they would send a group of officers into the West. It was known that there were pro-Confederate settlers in Colorado who were leaderless and dispirited, but who might be enlisted to fight. Also, Smith hoped that the Plains Indians could be enlisted to rise up against the United States government and basically create a distraction. This would take pressure maybe off of Vicksburg and kind of slow down the Southern defeat. And so, thus I've cut the head off of this gentleman. Charles Harrison had just earlier during the war had the rank of captain. He's promoted to lieutenant colonel, and he's going to be leading this expedition through Kansas. Charlie Harrison was a colorful character and would have been well known out in Denver, Colorado. Harrison is chosen because he lived in the West. He knows the way. He knows many of the pro-Southern people out in Colorado. And I've never been able to find a picture of the man. That's why I just picked a picture of a Confederate colonel, and I took the top of the head off then, because it's not really him. The uniform is right. The pistol, the Colt revolver, Harrison was known to carry Navy Colt revolvers. And in Denver, he's basically a bar owner, a brothel owner, and a gunslinger. So he's one of these kind of Wild West characters. I'm not sure where Harrison came from originally in the South. There are Harrisons in Virginia and in several other states, but Charlie Harrison, before he came to Denver, he arrived from the West. He had been further west and had come through Utah and into Colorado from that direction. And he's a professional gambler. So where would you be in the far West if you're a professional gambler? Probably San Francisco, following the gold rush. So I think that he was from the South, went probably to San Francisco. It was known that he was being pursued through Utah by angry Mormons because he had stolen horses from them. Bad idea. So he barely gets out of Utah, makes it to Colorado, and he runs a bar called the Criterion Saloon, and he also went into the prostitution business there. So he's not a Southern gentleman. There's an earlier account of all this that was written by actually someone I knew about 15, 20 years ago, and he couldn't find information on Harrison, but he speculated that he's almost like a Robert E. Lee figure. No. He is not a Southern gentleman, but he has the right skill set to lead this expedition west. And also, he had served earlier as an irregular with William Quantrell up in Jackson County, Missouri. So he has a history of being a bushwhacker and basically a killer. And two teenagers up in Jackson County, Missouri were big admirers of Charlie Harrison, Frank and Jesse James, because people said that he would shoot you as quick as he would look at you. So Harrison also has a girlfriend named Addie Lamont down in Denver, and she was a brothel operator as well. First, they were rivals, and then they became romantically involved. And so there are Colorado sources of Addie Lamont learning that her boyfriend Charlie had been killed by some Osage Indians. So you have to really look beyond just Kansas sources, and you can find stuff about these people that spill over the state lines. But Harrison is going to be put in command of a group, and the numbers vary, 21, 22, 23 Confederate officers. Different newspaper articles give different numbers, but you can find the names of about 17 or 18 of them. And all of them, I think, got a promotion in rank. So if you'd been, a lieutenant, we'll make you a captain. Late in the Civil War, everyone's getting a promotion. As the South is losing, the ranks keep going up. So it's like Colonel Harlan Sanders. I mean, by the end of the war, virtually everyone is a, high-ranking officer. But Harrison, this is, I think, his chance in a way, not just to get promoted, but to go back to Denver, where he has some scores to settle. The state militia of Colorado pointed a cannon at the front door of his saloon and told him and his friends to get lost. They were flying the stars and bars, the first Confederate flag over the Criterion Saloon, and stirring people up in favor of the South And local authorities said, nope, you're not welcome. So he would have lost all his property and been unceremoniously disarmed and booted out of the state. So he's looking for payback, I think. So Harrison is camped out along Shoal Creek, just outside of Joplin, Missouri, and he's going to lead these men straight across southeast Kansas in the direction of Colorado. That puts him on a collision course with the Osage Nation. He's going to ride right through the area where all their villages are. That turns out to be a really bad idea. He should have gone south through Oklahoma and then come north and avoided them. The only thing I can think of is that maybe he figured they were away buffalo hunting, because twice a year, all the Osage would go west of the Arkansas River to hunt buffalo. So if they weren't in their villages, it would have been okay. But Harrison and his men, they've got to ford multiple rivers, the Spring River, the Neosho River, and then the Verdigris River. And they set out. And I talked to a gentleman over in Missouri who had very interesting sources about Charlie Harrison and these people before the expedition that turns out to be their last expedition for most of them. They've been maybe 3-4 days on the trail, and apparently they weren't maintaining, maybe they were, starting fires and making smoke, but they were leaving a trail, and the Osage were expert trackers. They determined that horsemen had come through, and Wahisaki, or Hard Rope, and a group of about 10 warriors intercept Charlie Harrison and his men. They want to know, what are you doing here? And Harrison and his men were wearing blue coats. They're in disguise. They're trying to look like Union cavalry or Union militia. And Wahisaki, his English was not great. Maybe there was someone else who was a better communicator, but they asked these Confederates, where are you headed, heavily armed? What are you doing here? And apparently Harrison initially said that, we're Kansas cavalry out of Humboldt. And the Osage said, no, we know all of them. And you're not from Humboldt, And so there's kind of a standoff. The Confederates outnumber the Osage at this point. Wahisaki, Hard Rope, said, just follow us up to Humboldt. We can clear all this up. We'll talk to the commander there, and then you'll be free to go on your way. One of the Confederate officers panicked, and he pulled a pistol and he shot one of the Osage out of the saddle. At that point, Hard Rope and the other Osage, they scatter, and unfortunately for Harrison and the Confederates, they couldn't have been more than maybe 3 or 4 miles from the village of the Big Hill or Pas Soleil Band. That's the largest division of the Osage. They number hundreds of inhabitants, and their village is very close by. And so within minutes, Hard Rope comes back with Little Beaver, another chief, and probably 200 warriors who are very angry. And what follows then is a pursuit. The Confederates ride westward, and there's a number of different good Osage accounts of this. The Osage historians say that the Osage were treated like a buffalo hunt. They're driving the Confederates straight west and flanking them to keep them from going either north or south, because they know that the Verdigris River has high banks. You're going to trap them against that river. And that's what happens. The pursuit lasts for about maybe 5 miles. 2 Confederates were shot and killed during the pursuit. The survivors arrive along the river, and the land looks a lot different back then than it does today. Back then, you just had cottonwoods and trees along the rivers and creeks and tall grass prairie in between. So think of your Little House on the Prairie vision of Kansas. That's the way things looked back in 1863. And so the Confederates probably thought they were in luck that they could use the trees for cover, but that allowed the Osage to infiltrate closer and start picking them off. And so the accounts say that the Confederates ran out of rifle ammunition. They were reduced to using their pistols. And then eventually all but 2 are killed by the Osage. One man was wounded, a man named Rafferty, and another gentleman, and they managed to crawl over the bluff into the gorge of the Verdigris River and hide. They probably got under the bluff and concealed themselves, and they weren't seen, and they managed to get back to Missouri alive. So Colonel, he's a colonel too, Warner Lewis at this time was like a lieutenant. He finishes the war colonel like everybody else, so I guess that's good. Lewis and Rafferty managed to walk all the way back to Missouri, which takes them days. They didn't have canteens. They didn't have supplies. One of them had lost his boots somehow. This was a terrible journey. They made it alive. Rafferty is later killed during the war. Warner Lewis lives to write the best account on the part of white people about what happened, an account by someone who was actually a witness to the events. And Warner Lewis, he lives a long life in Missouri, but his son, he has another kind of a tragedy from a political point of view. Warner Lewis is a Southern Democrat, and his son ran for the governorship of Missouri as a Republican, as a Lincoln Republican. So not good. In any event, Warner Lewis kind of gives you the white perspective of what happened. Once all these men are dead, the Osage kind of have a tradition of how to treat trespassers, which was these men are scalped and their heads were put on posts as signage. It's like, don't make the mistake this guy did. Actually, I found significant information about Wahesaki, who's the band chief during this fight. He's much more a diplomat than a warrior. These men wouldn't have been killed if they'd gone to Humboldt. They would have become POWs, though. But there's some folks out there that make it out like the Osage are bloodthirsty. Not so much. Now, you could get on their bad side. If you're on Osage land and you're hunting without permission, the Osage regarded themselves as protectors of animals who are their younger brothers. They'd kill you for that. If you're on their land, you've killed a deer, that could be a fatal mistake. But generally speaking, they're not looking for trouble. And so the Confederates at what's called Rebel Creek now in Montgomery County, they created their own problems by resorting to violence first. And so Independence, Kansas is located right in the center of Montgomery County, which Montgomery County's southern border reaches the Oklahoma line. And so it's just outside of town to the north and a little bit to the east along the Verdigris River is where this happened. People have gone with metal detectors trying to find material evidence. The Union troopers who showed up like a day later were Kansas Cavalry, the Kansas 9th Cavalry out of Humboldt. By then, the bodies, it's high summer, the bodies were seriously degraded and deteriorated. And they searched them. They found papers that confirmed what the mission was, military orders. They also found evidence that Charlie Harrison and his crew, that they had been instructed basically to, if possible, start an Indian war or to raise troops out in Colorado. And there's Colorado records that show that men were being rounded up by the Colorado militia at the same time, who were apparently waiting for these Confederates to show up. And one of the officers who participated in that rounding up of these Confederate recruits was the commander at the Sand Creek Massacre later of the Cheyenne. Name is escaping, who knows? Shivington. Shivington actually was in command in eastern Colorado, and he was one of the people who was rounding up these dispirited, basically unarmed people waiting for this Confederate mission. One thing that the Union Cavalry didn't find was money, and there's indications that the Confederates had gold. The Osage probably took that, and also they kept any horses that weren't killed or weren't damaged, and they also kept the weapons as well. But at this point in time, things are not going well on the Missouri-Kansas border in terms of the war. Quantrell and his people are regularly raiding into Kansas territory. And so there's a brief kind of an upsurge of enthusiasm on the Kansas pro-northern side that the Osage are going to be useful as allies in patrolling the frontier and protecting Kansas from bushwhackers, from raiders. They did raise a regiment of Osage down at Fort Scott. This did not work out so well. 5 minutes. The Osage are not good saluting and fighting like conventional soldiers. You really need to leave them to do what they do best. And so the regiment was disbanded. It became clear that these are not good recruits to be regular soldiers. But the Osage did patrol the Kansas border and prevented infiltration by pro-Confederate spies and other folks coming into Kansas. Typically, they would track them, and if they did nothing wrong, they would stop them, disarm them, turn around, and send them home. So again, the Osage are not bloodthirsty. They did find it amusing that some of the Confederate spies came into Kansas dressed in what they thought were Indian costumes. And apparently those were very amusing. But they didn't kill these guys. They did, take their guns, probably their horses, and tell them to get lost. The Osage also during the war welcomed many refugees. People like the Wichitas who came north basically to escape Confederate authorities, and those Native Americans were allowed to live on Osage lands. After the war, though, there's a continued push to take Osage land, and there's a number of treaties which whittle away. Neosho and Labette counties were taken. Then you had a railroad company, the Leavenworth, Lawrence, and Galveston Railroad, tried to buy all Osage land in Kansas for 35 cents an acre. Congress didn't ratify that. But finally, in 1870, there's an appropriation bill in which the Osage were given $1.25 an acre. That's only when it's sold. So in other words, and also the money wasn't given to the Osage, it was put in an account managed by the United States Senate. So later on, when the Osage are literally starving, they're asking the federal government, can we have some of our money for food? They say no. So the Osage are going to be removed in the winter of 1870-71. That's just an indication of villages right around Independence that are known village sites. The people of Independence paid $3 for each 160-acre claim. That was actually illegal. Those were later overturned, but the Osage were getting ripped off repeatedly. George Armstrong Custer used the Osage as scouts during his winter campaign against the Cheyenne for the Battle of the Washita. The Osage were excellent scouts. Custer never would have located the village of Black Kettle in the middle of winter without the Osage leading him there. And he writes commendations of the Osage about how loyal and how good they are. None of that, though, really translates into anything tangible for the Osage people. And when they were moved in 1870-71, the next time you have a count, a tribal roll, it's clear that about 10% of the Osage are gone, which I think is likely mortality. Especially very young people and very old people don't survive removals. And the Osage were located at a place called Silver Bell, which is near modern-day Bartlesville, Oklahoma. And then a year later, after they had started building houses and breaking the land to farm, the federal authorities came back and said, oh, sorry, your land is actually west of here. You're in the wrong place. It got removed again. So mismanagement is part of the story as well. Finally, if you've seen the movie or read the book, Killers of the Flower Moon, the Osage gave up a fortune in oil in Kansas and got another fortune randomly in Oklahoma. And by the early 19th century, they're being murdered for their money. So it's really only until the mid-20th century that Osage numbers have rebounded. And today there's about 20,000 members of the Osage Nation. Most of them, though, are mixed bloods with, 1/64th, 1/16th. But still, the Osage rules are if you have Osage ancestry, they want you. So certain other Native communities have different rules. But I was given the 5-minute warning, so questions and comments. Yes, ma'am.
I have a microphone for you.
Oh, cool.
When you have questions, so we can all hear you.
I realize your focus is on Osage Indians, but if I want the Indians that still remain up north of
They might not have gone either direction, depending on what circumstance. They might have just been there. Generally speaking, it depends on their numbers too. If they represent a population that can be used productively, militarily, then they're likely to be recruited. But the use of Native Americans as combatants, that goes back to the colonial era, and it rarely works in favor of the Native people. And in fact, you have earlier in history, you have Native Americans being used against other Native Americans. In other words, like pro-French Indians killing pro-British Indians. At the end of the day, there's fewer Native people left. So, but I don't know about that one. I have to research that and find out. There were likely individuals, but I don't know if they actually went to the entire nation or group and said, we want to recruit and form a formal unit. They might have been too small for that. Yeah, yeah.
Question over here.
Where have you done the majority of your research?
For this particular topic,
Yes.
some materials are in Kansas, some are like government documents. And then it turned out that there was materials in Missouri and in Colorado. And there's kind of local Colorado histories. For example, like Charlie Harrison, they don't talk about him as a Confederate, also they talk about him as a gunslinger. So you have like that chapter of his life. In the history of Denver, he's a character. So yeah, you've got to find all this different stuff and then put it together, and then it makes sense. But what I haven't found are the orders that were confiscated from the dead Confederates. Papers, the Osage found them, they couldn't read them. And so they called a chief who wasn't there named, well, Governor Joe. His name was actually Joseph Pawnee No Pache. And he had been educated by the Jesuits, and he could read and write. And he came and looked at the document and said, oh, they are Confederates. Because the Osage were worried they'd killed the wrong people if these guys were pro-Union. And then it was confirmed. Then they called the cavalry to come and deal with the remains. But I've not found those documents. They may not have survived. Apparently there was blood on those papers because they were taken off a body. And so who knows, maybe someone threw them out. But I'm sure there's more materials out there. And once I am thoroughly retired, then I'll have the luxury of trying to hunt down the tougher to find stuff. Yes, sir.
Sorry, can you repeat that question for me?
Wonder if he was familiar with the Osage and cattle fight with the Tonkawas in Oklahoma.
Yeah, I've read about that. There's several of those kind of events, and the Osage actually pursued those people way south. They continued, going after them. Where Neodesha, Kansas is today, that was a community related to like the Tonkawas and Wichitas, and there was a battle there where the Osage, it was sort of, I guess, had palisades. It was like a walled village, and that would be back in like the 1790s, and they forced them out as well. But yeah, it's after the Civil War. Apparently, some of those native groups that had lived in Kansas they actually do make peace with the Osage once they're down in Oklahoma. I've read articles where like Wichita chiefs, visited the Osage at Pawhuska, and they formally like shook hands and said, "We're done, and we're no longer enemies." And typically there'd be gift giving and things like that would go along with that. So, but yeah, there's a long period where there's bad blood between the original inhabitants and the Osage who came in, and some of that is actually over buffalo hunting turf. So the Osage, when they would go west to hunt, that's kind of they'd be fighting the Cheyenne and the Pawnee and Arapahoes, and multiple Indian nations use the same resource. And so you go hunting, but also there'd be fighting as well. So.
The lady with cattle, and she was telling the story of what started the fight, and she didn't say the Tonkawas supposedly took this little boy. She said they did.
Oh.
So that story is still alive in the cattle tribe.
Yeah, all of those, it's like the Arikaras of the North, they all speak similar languages. And so, and they recognize that. So I'm trying to remember which one it was. When the Pawnee were removed from Nebraska and sent down to Oklahoma, they asked to be put next to some of like those Kansas tribes. Like we're related to them. So there's a kind of awareness of that. I've just looked in a cursory way at like the Sioux language that's spoken like Lakota Sioux and Osage, and you can see it's like French and Italian. You can actually see a lot of the words are sort of close to each other, not intelligible, but still you can see common origins, which it's just, if you're a nerd, you like that stuff. Yeah.
When the man first went to Denver, was it still part of Kansas territory?
Earlier, it would have been. And of course, Kansas decided we didn't want
Didn't want to deal-
Hell City, Denver anymore. Should have kept it, then we would have a ski industry in Kansas. But early on, it would have been part of Kansas, and then it gets split off. Yeah, there's a lot of good history about that early gold mining, and it was a rough place early on. As far as Charlie Harrison being pro-slavery and being pro-Southern, that's one of the stories in Denver is that he shot a black man, basically because he was black. And, I guess he had done a lot worse in the minds of local people. It's like, well, that's just another thing this guy did. Yeah. Also, the commander of the Union Cavalry was a man named Willoughby Doudna. He was from Ohio, and he was a Quaker. And so Quakers aren't supposed to join in the military during war, but he was one of the founders of Chautauqua, Kansas, which was burned to the ground. And so bad stuff was happening over in Missouri and in the border of Kansas. And I guess he had worked for a Cherokee landholder, an orchard over near Baxter Springs, and Matthews and the Confederates destroyed the orchard. That takes a lot of work to take out 20,000 trees. Apparently they did. So there was really kind of mutual hatreds. And so it was enough that a number of Quakers decided to serve during the war, and he was one of them. So that's kind of a strange thing you don't read about. The explanation by the Kansas Quakers was that when the devil and his followers rebelled in heaven, that God and the angels didn't just like pray about it, they fought. And so they try to find scriptural justification for violating their pacifism. But yeah, these stories are more interesting when you learn about the individuals and all this kind of quirky stuff. That particular ex-Quaker, he died out in Dodge City, and it was buried on Boot Hill next to gamblers and all kinds of bad guys. And he wasn't that way at all. So you don't know where you're going to wind up.
Any other questions before we wrap up? No one I missed?
Looks like there's still snacks back there. So.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. McCaffrey. Thank you for that wonderful presentation and for taking the time to answer everyone's questions here. I also want to thank Humanities Kansas Speakers Bureau for making this program today possible and free to the general public. And also our next Coffee with the Curator is a Humanities Kansas presentation. So be sure to come here for that one. And we also have our Hands-on History program coming up today. That will be at 3 o'clock this afternoon if you would like to stick around and do that program. It's $5 per person, and you'll get to hold real historic artifacts and learn a lot about that. So head down to the front desk and let them know if you would like to participate in Hands-on History. And thank you all for being here today, and have a wonderful afternoon.